Well, that's not going to work. I'm going to show you how to make it fit. Alright, so I've got two drive shafts here. This is the front, this is the rear. They are both too long. I'm doing a motor swap, transmission, transfer case. All of it's being swapped, so nothing fits. Well, actually, this was the original front drive shaft, but I'm going with this one because it's easier to shorten one than it is to lengthen it. So I'm going to start with the front one. First thing you want to do is cut that weld out with a grinder, and then this yoke should slide out, and then we'll cut the tube to the right length, weld it back together. That's the plan, at least. Alright, so now I'm going to want to clean this up a little bit. Try to get all that extra weld and whatnot off of there so it'll slide into the tube easily. Alright, so I got it all cleaned up. There's a little notch in there where I went too deep with the cutoff wheel, but it'll fill back in with weld. It'll be alright. But I just used a flap disc to clean it up, so I didn't want to like totally grind way too much off of this because it needs to fit tight back into that tube. Alright, so now I need to take a measurement. I'm going from that yoke to that yoke. I'm just going to measure to the inside part there on both ends, so that way I can just measure to the outside part of the U-joint, and theoretically it should be right. So it ended up being 31 3/16 was tight, so you got to take into consideration this is a slip joint. It doesn't have to be that tight, so you want that kind of in the center. That way you can have travel both directions. Never mind what I said about measuring to the outside. Measure to the center, it's easier. Alright, so the measurement is 30 inches exactly would be tight. So what I need to do is measure what this is going to take up and then subtract it from the overall length of this, and then I'll know how much tube to cut off. Alright, so that's 4 1/4. So I'm going to want to subtract 4 1/4 from 30, and that will give me my overall length. Next, you're going to want to cut it square. So I'm going to use a chop saw. If you don't have a chop saw, it would be kind of hard to do with a grinder, but I guess it could be done. But just going to tighten that up in there, chop it. One other thing that's pretty important, these need to line up. I don't think it's so much important if you have a double carding joint, but typically your yokes should be in line with each other. I'm just going to lay it on the table here and try to get these two yokes in line with one another. Should be close enough. Alright, so I got it back in there, double check the measurements, it's good. It fits in there pretty tight, but just do your best to get it lined up in there straight. Ideally you'd have it like on a lathe or probably some sorts of machine to get that perfect, but it doesn't have to be perfect, at least not from this application. This is a front drive shaft and I have manual locking hubs, so it's not going to spin at high speeds anyway. It's only going to spin when you're in four-wheel drive, which I'm usually only ever in four low. So this will be a good trial run to see if this works. Alright, so last thing, I want to clean this edge up a little bit, clean the burrs off of it, and then weld it together. There it is, all burned in. I did 2 passes on it. I think it'll hold. Probably got the U-joint way hotter than it ought to have been, but oh well. If it needs replaced, I'll replace it. Alright, so now I'm going to do the rear drive shaft. It's pretty much the same, it just doesn't have a double carding joint. And one thing I already noticed, that's sitting upright. That one's angled. So most likely somebody slipped this joint off and put it back together wrong. But these should be lined up. But anyway, we'll straighten that out. I'm going to cut it off this end, do the same thing, just cut that weld right there and knock this yoke off with a hammer. Alright, so same thing, I gotta clean up this edge, grind that, like put a little bevel in it so it welds nicely, and cut the tube to length, stick it back together and weld it. Alright, so for the rear shaft, obviously we're going from the, I'm going to go from the center point, which is this outer point right here. That's the center of your U-joint. Go from center to center on that one. Get my measurement. Alright, so it's 53 inches is tight. So I can't get that to go in there. I know it'll fit, but it's so tight. I don't want to mess it up beating it in there with a hammer. So I'm going to throw this in the freezer for a few minutes. And I'm going to heat the other piece up. Maybe then it'll go in. I think it's a really tight fit. I got it in there though. Even with the heat and the cooling this off, it still didn't want to go. Now all I got to do is weld it in. Alright, so I've got it all booger welded together. That's pretty much it. I'm going to paint them and grease the U-joints and the slip joint before I put it back in, but that's basically all there is to it. Well, isn't that magical? Somebody was nice enough to break off a bolt in there for me.